The Debrief is a production of faculty affiliated with the National Security Affairs Department at the U.S. Naval War College. The views presented here are those of the speakers and do not reflect the positions of the Department of Defense, the United States government, or any of its components. Welcome to the Debrief, where we deconstruct defense, diplomacy, and developments in national security affairs at the U.S. Naval War College. I'm your co-host, Theo Milanopoulos. The Arctic encompasses the territory of 8 countries, as well as vital geologic features and strategic waterways, making the region an area of geopolitical contestation and concern over a changing climate. Here to help us navigate these waters is Dr. Mary Thompson-Jones, a retired senior foreign service officer and chair of Women in Diplomacy and National Security at the Naval War College. She's the author of a new book, America in the Arctic: Foreign Policy and Competition in the Melting North. Mary, thanks for joining us here on the Debrief. So as I'm sure you know, for people like me that are relatively uninformed, when they think of the Arctic, they think about ice caps, they think about polar bears, maybe even NORAD's Santa tracker. What exactly, could you provide us with an overview of what the Arctic is and what it has in terms of its importance geographically and geopolitically?
Sure. Thanks for having me, Theo. It's nice to talk to you about the Arctic. Well, the Arctic is certainly multi-domain. It's the world's shallowest ocean. It's the smallest. It's the least saline because of the infusion of fresh water from continents and countries like Russia and Canada. It's also ringed by land. This makes it the opposite of Antarctica. And it's inhabited by about 4.5 million people who reside in 8 countries. Now, the other half of your question is about what constitutes the Arctic. And this is a subject of debate. Classically, the Arctic exists at 66 degrees 0.34 minutes north latitude. If you look at a globe, you see the dotted line of the Arctic Circle at that point. Mm-hmm. However, the International Maritime Organization delimits it at anything at 60 degrees north latitude or higher. This is interesting because at 60 degrees you start to capture capitals in Scandinavia, St. Petersburg, you catch the tip of Greenland, so it starts becoming a lot more inhabited. The U.S. has its own definition of the Arctic, and while you trace the 66 degrees around the globe, as you come to Alaska, it dips down all the way down to encompass the Aleutian Island chain, and that reaches 52.2 degrees north latitude. So there's other ways of defining it as well. The 10-degree isotherm line, which some scientists like, this is the point at which no territory exceeds 10 degrees Celsius, which is 50 degrees centigrade, Fahrenheit, in July, which is the hottest month in the Arctic. We also look at the tree line, which is changing as the climate is changing in the Arctic, and we look at, of course, economic exclusion zones, which push countries' claims 200 degrees to the 200-mile limit. And recently, the United States, along with other countries, has filed extended continental shelf claims for territory under the water column. So it's a mixed bag. There's lots of ways to talk about the Arctic.
I guess it depends on who you speak to when it comes to defining the Arctic. Now, in the book, you described the Arctic as both a militarized and melting domain. How are states beginning to navigate those twin challenges?
It varies considerably by state, but I think that one thing that all states realize is that they must have an Arctic presence. That's certainly true for the United States. We can talk about what an Arctic presence means. Obviously, people live there, people of various nationalities, but it means a sustained presence, military, national security presence, perhaps also a commercial trade presence as well. So all of this goes into what nation states have to do in order to maintain a credible Arctic presence.
Now, your book rightly points out that the United States is an Arctic nation, not just because of Alaska in terms of its territorial reach, but going back to even some parts of the continental United States, especially with Maine. How do you think of and define U.S. interests in the Arctic, and how have those evolved over time?
Well, I think just as the Arctic is multi-domain, our interests are multidisciplinary. And certainly national security will always be paramount in terms of protecting our own territory. But the Arctic is rich in resources. We're hearing a lot of talk about critical minerals, a lot of talk about commercial development and exploitation, and many states are also looking at this. Certainly government policy starts in Washington, but the 50 states, surprising number of them, have interests in the Arctic. American municipalities, citizens, organizations, NGOs, and certainly business and trade also are interested. So it really is a multidisciplinary part of the world.
Now, moving further north, Canadian territory encompasses about 40% of the Arctic shoreline, which is second only to Russia. What kinds of diplomatic and economic tensions has the United States had to navigate in its relationship with Canada in Arctic affairs, and what mechanisms have been used to resolve those kinds of tensions?
There's a long history of collaboration and cooperation with our good neighbors, Canada. And Canada has an archipelago that reaches far into the Arctic. We worked with Canada to build the Alaska-Canada Highway, to build the Dew Line, which secures both of our countries across from Alaska all the way through to Greenland. But yes, we've had disputes at times. One of them involves the vaunted Northwest Passage, which is central to Canadian identity. It's also a difficult place to cross or traverse the Arctic. There's not just one Northwest Passage, there are many routes, and as I mentioned earlier, it's shallow. It's also ice-filled, and while the Russian passage, the Northern Sea route, is often ice-free, the Canadian route is much colder and often clogged with ice, so this makes it a little different. After many years of disputing who owns the right to sail through the Northwest Passage, the United States and Canada came to what they called a gentleman's agreement, which is that the United States does not acknowledge that these are not international waters, but gives our good friends and partners, Canada, the courtesy of notifying them when we intend to sail through those waters. That's worked out brilliantly. Every summer we have the Healy, the Coast Guard cutter, which makes its voyage mostly for scientific and research purposes. We collaborate with Canadian scientists on scientific missions up there, as well as security and military missions.
Great. And moving a little further east, I suppose, the status of Greenland has been in the news, in part because of renewed American interest in the territory. Can you provide an overview of its standing as a self-ruling territory of Denmark? How have these interests, American interests in Greenland, evolved over time? And what is likely to be the future of Greenland, given this kind of nascent independence movement that has been around for a couple decades?
But you're right, Greenland is really a hot topic right now. And one of the things that's fascinating is that America has had a presence in Greenland for 85 years. During World War II, during the Nazi invasion of Denmark, the United States actually took over Greenland and supplied Greenlandic peoples with food and equipment and ran the war effort partly through more than 24 bases that we constructed in Greenland. So we do have a history there, but it goes back even before that to the Civil War. Certainly American explorers such as Robert Peary, Elisha Kent King, and others, including Louisa Arner Boyd, did a lot of work in terms of charting unknown territory. You can see their names in maps, old maps of Greenland. And we see other interests as well, artistic, cultural interests. So there's a lot to talk about when we think about Greenland beyond just the current headlines. We have a history there. What's interesting right now is that New York has the 109th National Guard Air Squadron, and they supply the summit camp in the center of Greenland, which is something that we created through the National Science Foundation with collaboration with Danes and with Greenlandic peoples in order to establish and run a year-round science center right on top of the ice shield. And that is supplied and sustained through the efforts of the 109th, which is a great use for the Air National Guard and is a great example of military and scientific cooperation to advance the interest of mankind.
And if we move even just slightly east of there and think about Russia, how has Russia's militarization of the Arctic influenced the way both the United States is approaching the region, perhaps the renewed interest in Greenland's territory? What influence is that having in the area?
Well, there's no question. We've come a long time from the famous speech by Gorbachev in Murmansk, in which he proposed the Arctic as a future zone of peace. Sadly, those days are gone, and that sentiment is no longer true. Russia has engaged in an astounding buildup of its Arctic security military assets throughout the Arctic region, and it has used them to sustain its efforts in Ukraine, which is exactly the opposite of what Gorbachev had proposed. In reaction to that, NATO has seen the expansion and the entrance of Finland and Sweden to Arctic nations, resulting in a situation in which 7 of the 8 Arctic nations are also NATO allies. So certainly we're looking at a much more militarized Arctic. Russia has reacted to this. We've seen a lot of increase in tensions between Russia and Finland along the very long border between those two countries, and certainly within the waters, not only in the Arctic but in the high north, the Greenland, Iceland, UK gap. We've seen increasing evidence of Russian incursions and mischief, cutting cable lines that connected Svalbard to Norway and other problems. So yeah, it's become a hot zone.
And now one consistent theme throughout the book is the role of indigenous inhabitants of the Arctic, who often have superior knowledge of those officials that are in faraway foreign capitals about the region, about the climate. How do you see the relationship between indigenous inhabitants and those that are ruling the territory within the Arctic evolving over time?
This is indeed a part of the Arctic that has evolved. One of the fascinating aspects of this is something called the Inuit Circumpolar Council, which was actually created by an Alaskan native back in 1977 because he found that Alaskan natives felt they had something in common with First Nations who lived in Canada in the Arctic, along with Greenlandic peoples, and going across to the European Arctic to Nenets and other Russian natives, and that they had more in common with each other and with the harsh realities of living in a very challenging climate than they did with their capitals. They've continued to meet, they've continued to advocate. I don't see a time when they will ever become a nation state, but they are definitely a political force that all governments have to reckon with. And they've had some impact, particularly in the field of science. Scientists have been very receptive to what you intimated earlier, the deep knowledge that Native peoples have from living and being on their land for so many generations. They also have an oral tradition, so they are able to pull knowledge from their ancestors forward to the present. And scientists have been very forward-leaning in incorporating their research designs by using Inuit knowledge, consulting with Inuit people, and having them join in investigations and revealing their findings to them. There's something of a code of ethics that many scientists follow now. And the great result of this is that it's a win-win. We have better data and better knowledge because of this. So it's definitely a strategy that we will see increasing as science moves forward in the region.
Right. Now, one of the other things you've written about are these mega projects that the United States is undertaking in the Arctic. I was wondering if you could give us an overview of what those projects are and how they're altering the Arctic's built environment.
Well, they definitely were a feature of the 20th century. And we start right at the beginning of 1900s with John Munro Longyear, who created the Arctic Coal Company in Svalbard. His presence changed the perception of the Arctic in the United States. Up until then, during the Age of Sail, Europeans and North Americans saw the Arctic as a transportation problem. How do you get through it? And the Arctic is littered with shipwrecks from one end to the other, some of them quite famous. John Munro Longyear was among the first to look at the Arctic as an engineering problem. What can we do with it? How can we have a presence? How can we exploit it commercially? And he saw the opportunity for coal and set off a century in which Americans built huge, sometimes security-oriented things, certainly Keflavik Air Base in Iceland, which at its peak had half of all the population of Iceland in terms of American troops, all concentrated on an air base. There are about 60,000 in the population of Iceland. Back in World War II was about 120,000. We see these massive numbers as a characteristic of mega projects, people pulled from outside the region to come and build. We saw this with Thule Air Base, which has since become Patufic Space Base. Huge number of ships, personnel, material, all being shipped in to build something from outside. The same was true for the Dew Line, which comprised 63 stations of various sizes and capabilities across a line, looking at early warning of missiles coming from what was then the Soviet Union. We see it with the Alcan Highway, which was an incredible engineering feat, which also was the first time where we see about a third of the workers as Black Americans who were working as part of the U.S. military back in 1942-43, before the full integration of the U.S. military, which did not take place until 1948. So it's a real example of early contributions of African Americans to U.S. military efforts in the region. They had to build the highway in a hurry because the Pacific War had already resulted in the taking of Atuk and Kiska Islands in the Aleutian Island chain, the first time that American territory had been invaded and occupied, and was occupied for 18 months. Moving forward, of course, in Alaska, huge mega projects there. Most noteworthy is perhaps the Alaska Pipeline, 812 miles from Prudhoe Bay all the way down to the port, Valdez, to transport oil. Again, huge mega projects. We don't do that anymore. We've learned that this is certainly environmentally unfriendly, but what's also happened is that terrain has changed, and it's challenging to build massive infrastructure because just as we're seeing less ice in the Arctic Ocean, we're seeing permafrost softening and thawing. And when this happens, you have roads buckling, you have buildings collapsing or cracking, leaking, and it's presented a real engineering challenge for next generation Arctic builders. And I suspect the answer will be smaller scale, more environmentally savvy, and certainly consulting more with local inhabitants, be they native inhabitants or others who also happen to live up there and who are more used to the challenges that the weather faces and are confronting a lot of new challenges because of the climate and issues that are occurring with that.
Right. Now, you've argued for taking a more holistic approach to the Arctic than perhaps what a focus on geopolitical competition among major powers in the region might look like. What does the future of the Arctic look like, and what does a holistic approach entail?
Well, I think that's a huge question. One thing that I see is more focus on regions within the Arctic. We are often in the habit of talking about the Arctic as though it's one area. Certainly the Western Hemisphere Arctic, which is to say Alaska, Canada, Greenland, Iceland, have certain qualities and traits that are different from what the European Arctic faces. And perhaps as we move forward, we'll see collaborations on a small scale, a few nations collaborating together. We see this already with Scandinavian nations. They're used to this. They've been doing this for a long time. They're very comfortable doing this. I can imagine that we might see more of this as well. I also do think that it's multidisciplinary, and it will invite talents from a wide range of disciplines. Engineers, as we were just mentioning, certainly people who are conversant in branches of science that are just now developing and deepening, glaciology, other parts of ice science that are being discovered. There's a lot of new science going on, which is really exciting, and certainly findings from this will benefit mankind as a whole. So I'm excited about some of the prospects I see. Will there be exploitation? Yes. There are a lot of critical minerals. There are a lot of natural resources. And I am sure that we will also see competition as nations vie for this and perhaps vie over whose territory there is. The continental shelf is still not completely adjudicated. The Lomonosov Ridge, which runs through roughly the center of the Arctic, is something that is still being disputed between Russia and Greenland, which both are claiming that. So I think we will see both progress and disputes as we go forward.
So it sounds like the Arctic is not a topic that will be on ice anytime soon. Mary, thank you very much for joining us here on the Debrief.
Thank you, Theo, for having me.